priority to me is that you get your assignments done and your project done. And the other topics that I will talk about will be tables and JavaScript. JavaScript is, I typically use JavaScript in this class. We do as much as we can. And anything that we do, it's important just to show the role of JavaScript more than the details of it. And tables is something that we should cover. Are there any questions either about your assignment or your project? Good. I guess everyone is just about done, just waiting to turn it in. It's excellent. I do have to show you, and this site pops up a lot when I ask you for like the worst website or bad websites. This one pops up a lot. So I saw it yesterday and it was like, oh, I remember this one. So let's take a look at it. Okay, get ready. I will have to say, and I'm not even joking about this, if anyone is prone to seizures with flashing lights, please look away. Close your eyes. I hope we really need sound to get the full effect. Why no sound? Oh, I don't have the computer.
On a mountain top was burning like a silver flame, a summit of beauty and love, and Venus was her name. She's got it, yeah baby, she's got it. Well, I'm your Venus, I'm your fire and your desire. Well, I'm your Venus, I'm your fire and your desire.
And apparently, I mean, this is a legitimate...
Ladies and gentlemen, you want to know what's the best car there is. The thing is...
Apparently this is a legitimate business, I guess. I assume this isn't done for a joke. It looks like you can lease cars from this place. I assume. So, what a great bad website. So, if you're insecure about your project, know that there's a good chance your project, no matter how bad you do on it, is not going to be as bad as that. All right? So that should give you a little boost of confidence. And the interesting thing is, of course, in one respect, he has us talking about his website, and it caught our interest. So, it drew attention to it, but God knows if I was going to try to actually do something on the site other than to look at it and laugh at it, it would be difficult. And the funny thing is it takes a lot of work to make something that bad, I see a lot of websites that I look at and said, the web developers would have did a much better job if they would have hired lazier web developers. Right? Someone that goofed off and didn't do as much, because that would have simplified things. Anyhow, Our next topic that we're going to talk about is tables. And I'm going to just give a very brief history lesson for those of you that may have done some web development before. This will be relevant. If you have not done web development prior to this class, you can listen if you want, or you can just think pleasant thoughts for the next 5 minutes or so. Tables are needed for a specific reason in web pages. They're needed for having tabular data. That is a table of data. And what do I mean by a table of data? I mean a data where there are rows and columns of data. All right? Like you would get in an Excel worksheet. So, if you would think of a weather forecast, all right, across the United States, the city, the forecast for Tuesday, the forecast for Wednesday, the forecast for Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 5-day forecast, and maybe Cleveland, you know, maybe today will be 85 and sunny. Maybe tomorrow will be 88 and sunny. Thursday maybe 89 and rain, and so on. Maybe Los Angeles will be 95 and sunny, 92 and sunny, and so on. But there's rows and columns of data. That's what we use for a table. All right? So a table is a structure that has rows and columns of data. And if you can see, all right, if you have vision, if you can see, then you understand what each piece of data means because you can look and see what row and column it belongs to. So, for example, what does 92 and sunny mean? It is, for Los Angeles, Wednesday's forecast. So you do that almost without thinking. Your eyes sort of go across to the row header and up to the column header. And you can see that that's what that belongs to. All right? Now keep that in mind because obviously people that can't see can't do that. So just like with forms, where we have a label tag, we're going to do something with the table for accessibility reasons. All right? So, pretty straightforward. How would you do something like this? Well, you know that if you try to use white space to space things out, that it wouldn't work. So, for example, let's go and try to make a table. All right, so if I try to do something like this, where I said city, and spaced over and said Tuesday, and spaced over and said Wednesday, and spaced over and said Thursday, and then put Cleveland, 88 and sunny, Wednesday 89 and rain, Thursday 87 and sunny, then I did this, Los Angeles 95 and sunny, and we'll just make it 95 and sunny all week there. We know that that's not going to display like a table, largely because I'm not showing you on the screen what it looks like. If I did that, if I just spaced it out in my code, that's not going to show like the table that I had drawn up on the board. All right, why not? HTML removes white space. So what is this going to look like? Just one line of data. So if I go and save this and view it in the browser, that's what it looks like. Well, it's obviously not what we want. Now, you could try all sorts of workarounds to get that to work. But the real answer is to put this in a table, because this really is a table of data. There are rows of data. There's a row for each city, and there's columns. There's a column for each day of the week. Now, I said a while ago that I was going to do a little mini history lesson. Before CSS was widely used, people would try to use tables to achieve the layout of their page. In other words, they'd make their whole page one giant table with maybe 2 rows and 2 columns. And in the top left cell, they'd put the company logo. And in the top right cell, they would put the company banner, the company name, mission statement, address, and so on. And in the lower left, they would put the navigation, and in the lower right, they'd put the content. So what you'd have is you'd have a layout that looked like this. Where this would be a table cell, this would be a table cell, this would be, and this would be. And you'd have like a logo, a banner, a nav, and content. All right. So you make the table be really wide, 100% of the screen, really tall, 100% of the height, and then you'd maybe divide it up and give a quarter to the first row, a quarter to the first column, and do it that way. The reason that people did this is because people wanted control of the layout, and yet CSS wasn't fully developed yet. And what's worse, browsers did not implement CSS correctly. There's a lot of bugs in CSS. Sort of like what you see now with there being some features of HTML5 and CSS3 that aren't available in all browsers. Well, back in the old days, CSS, the support for it was buggy. And it wouldn't work, and browsers would do things differently and all that. So developers said, well, enough of this. What we're going to do is we're going to put everything in a table, and then we can control the layout. So for the time, it was a good idea. All right. So one of those things like the Y2k bug, right, where back in the old days when memory was really, really, really expensive, it made sense to try to trim a couple characters off of every date. Well, yeah, until the year 2000 rolled around and everyone was concerned that civilization would crumble. All right. As it turned out, it didn't. On the other hand, there was substantial cost in going in and reworking a lot of programs so that they would not break during Y2K. At any rate, what is the problem with this layout that you can see? What is the issue with doing things using a table for a layout? It's rigid. Exactly. All right. In other words, with this layout, you're stuck with having a 2-column, 2-row layout. And if I want to change it, I have to change every HTML page that has that. All right. as opposed to a CSS-based layout, whereas I can put the CSS in one spot and I can change it, and I can make it flexible so that on a mobile device it looks one way, on another device it looks a different way. So with this, you were locked in to this structure. And again, that flexibility, that inflexibility, is why this is not a good idea. This required a lot more code. All right, it was harder to change. People would do all kinds of crazy stuff, like let's put a table inside of here too, to even get more control over the layout. I wrote HTML during that time, and it would get very, very, very convoluted. CSS was a big departure from that, and just a little bit of time playing with it was like, wow, this is so much better, so much more flexible, so much easier to do once you learn CSS. That's why in this class, I teach CSS pretty much along with HTML, because the two go together to make up a web page. All right? So we're not going to use tables to do layouts. It is wrong to do that. All right? There really is no good reason to do that in 2015. All right? But tables still have their place. So it's not like they got rid of tables from HTML5 or whatever. They simply said, well, here's a table tag, use it correctly. Use it when you really have a table of data, when you really have rows and columns of data. Sometimes tags are said to be deprecated. What deprecated means is that they're going to be phased out. They're in the process of being phased out, which means don't use them anymore. Table tags are not deprecated, because there still is a legitimate use for table tags. And doing the kind of page that I was just showing a minute ago with the weather forecast is an example of that. So, let's try to create this table. I'll leave the data down there so I can do some cut and paste. There's 4 or 5 main table tags, and there's 5, 4, something like that, table tags, and then there's styling associated with it and accessibility and so on. First important tag is the table tag. That says, hey, we got ourselves a table. All right? There's one table tag per table. You have a second table tag, you have a second table. All right? Tables consist of rows. All right? So the second tag that we have are TRs. So that indicates the start and end of a row. Each individual cell in a table is either a TH or a TD. So in this particular table, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 columns. So there'll be 4 cells in each row. They will either be THs or TDs. TH stands for table header. TD stands for table data. So, in this case, this top line, this isn't actually data, right? This is a header. This tells you what each column represents. You know, you're not going to say the weather forecast for city is that today is going to be Tuesday. All right? It's simply telling you what these things mean down here. So those are represented in TH tags. All right. The next row, the row for Cleveland, will again be a TR tag. But there's data in this row, so we will have TD cells. All right. Turns out I didn't need that data down there anyhow. All right, so there's our table. Table tag indicates the start and end of the table. The table is a collection of rows. This table has 3 rows. Each row is a collection of cells. The cells being either THs, which stands for table header, or the TD, which stands for table data. All right, let's go and look at this. So I go and save it. I look at the, and there we go. All right. Not very stylish, but again, you can imagine things like how wide the cells are, how wide the table is. All that have defaults, but all that we can change via our CSS. Notice that the THs by default are bold and centered. Now, it might not be obvious to you that they're bold and centered, but it will become obvious to you that they're bold and centered. So the default appearance of THs is that they're bold and centered. The default appearance of TDs is that they are left aligned and not bold. Now, you would not make something a TH just because you want to make it bold and centered. All right? If it's table data, you make it a TD. Then through your styling, you would make it bold and centered. Okay, and then you'd make THs some other way. All right? One thing I don't think we talked about when we talked about color blindness is that, for example, if I was going to make, if the only difference between a table heading and table row was the color, if I made, let's say, the table headers blue and centered, and I made the table data black and centered, I would want to show it in a way in addition to just changing the color, because people are colorblind and won't pick that up. So maybe I'd make it italics and blue, for example, or larger and green, for example. Now, how big did it make this table? Remember, there's no CSS on here yet. So we're looking at the default behavior of the table. How big did it make it? Pardon me? Well, this particular one looks to be about 30%. But I don't think we can say that in general. Yes?
Just as a paragraph would write?
Just as a paragraph would write? That's true. How did it decide how big to make each column? Pardon me? Right. It made it as big as it needs to be. So, for example, here is the city column. All right. How big is it? It's as big as the biggest entry within that column. So Los Angeles is the biggest entry in the city column, so it made it as big as Los Angeles. In these columns, it's kind of hard to tell because they're all about the same size. All right, Tuesday is about the same size as 95 and sunny, 85 and sunny. So you can't really tell how big it made it. Wednesday is pretty easy to tell. Wednesday is the biggest thing in that column, so it made it that big. All right. So by default, it will make the columns as big as they need to be. All right. Let's start putting some style on this. All right. So I'm going to put some CSS code on the table. And I'll do that to center the table on the page. So now when I do that, all right, it made it 70% and it centered it. Now if we look, this might not be real easy to tell. Let's do this. Let's add a lot of data in one of the columns. All right. All right. There it makes Thursday by far the biggest. All right. So, if you give a percentage to the table, if you give a size to the table, a width to the table, but don't give a width to the individual columns, it'll space them out based on their respective sizes. So Thursday's a lot bigger, so it gave Thursday the space. Now what happens when I try to resize this? Notice that I've given it some, I won't say impossible rules, but I've given it some rules that it's having trouble conforming with. Up to this point, it fits everything in fine. But when I make it a little bit smaller, it can't fit everything in on one line. So it drops it down to another line. So it dropped Los Angeles down to 2 lines, and it dropped the forecast for Thursday down to 2 lines. The bottom line is it's not going to cut off data. All right? So at this point, the table's no longer 70%, right? The table's taking up 100%, or even more than 100%, because it's actually scrolling off the page. But it's not going to cut off any of this data. You're not going to lose data in there. It's going to wrap it around and it'll figure it out. The reason I say this is that it's always important to remember that the browser can be quite clever in how it does things. So work with the browser and the browser's defaults, and don't try to sort of custom manage everything. All right? I think I can get rid of that now. Again, notice that it made the size based on the biggest thing in that column. So that one description was very long, so it made it that size. If you give a size to a particular cell in a column, then that size will apply for the entire column. So for example, if I want to make each of these 25% of the table, I can simply say th 25%. Right? It will size this, 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 and these other ones will fall in line as well. Remember, when I specify the width as a percentage, it's a percentage of the available space. So, the entire table takes up 70% of the page. Of that 70%, 25% is devoted to each column. Now, what if I didn't want the THs to be bold and centered? All right. I could do that. All right, and it lines it up. So again, there's still THs. They still mean table headers, but if you choose to display it a different way, you can display it a different way. It probably would be a good idea to indicate somehow that that row is different, that row represents headers. And one way we could do that would be with colors or border or anything else that we've learned so far. So I could do this. I could say and we have the background yellow going across. Now, I'm going to try to zoom in here. Notice how there's actually a little tiny space between there. All right. You can control that via the border collapse property. And that will remove that little tiny gap between them. Notice it tightened up a little bit. And now it's a continuous line. Now, I could define, let's say, for example, if I wanted to make sure the city column was a lot bigger than the rest of them. How would I do that? How would I make the city column wider than the rest of them? Give a class. All right? Or, in this case, since I only have to define one thing in that column, I could just give an ID to the header. And that would work too. So ID equals city, let's say. And then I could do width of 40%, let's say. All right, and there it tries to fit the rest in and does it. one second. Oh, go ahead.
So, I guess it kind of pertains to it, but what you're doing with the style up there, that's all CSS, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then you didn't have that back in the day, so how did you determine how to use size tables?
There were actually HTML attributes that you could put on. All right. So you could put on the table. You could put a width attribute right here on the table and say width 500 pixels or whatever. There are HTML attributes for a lot of the things that we control now via CSS. I'm going to go and I'm going to add a couple of rows here. Even though I'm duplicating data, just because I want to show you with a lot of data. Or with more data anyhow. Let's make the width 100%. All right. Notice one thing. We've given it impossible instructions. Right? We've said we wanted the city to be 40%. And we said we wanted each of these to be 25%. That adds up to be 115%. So what does it do? Well, it takes its best shot. It makes the city wider than the other two, and the other two approximately evenly sized. Let's get rid of this because it served its purpose. All right. One thing that you run into when you're reading a table of data is that your eye can drift a little bit. Like let's say each of these were different cities. And I was trying to read to see what the weather forecast was for Cleveland. Especially if the table is long and wide, as your eye goes across, it's liable to go up or down a row, and you're liable to get the wrong data. So, how could we fix that style-wise? Pardon me? We could put lines around it. We could either put grid lines. We could put a border underneath each row. All right. We could make each row an alternating color. All right. So, let's look at how to do that. How would I put a border underneath each row? What would the selector be? It would be TR, right? Because the table row is the thing that we want to do something to. What attribute do we want to change? We're going to do something with the border. Do we want to do it in all four directions? No, just the bottom. That would be one way that you could do something like that to make it more readable. The line sort of helps guide your eye as it goes across. Another thing you could do is you could make alternating colors. Now there's actually a new way to do that in CSS3 if I'm not mistaken. Let's try to find that. You used to have to go and assign 2 different classes, or at least 1 different class, like an odd class. This allows you to look at and tr the nth child, in other words, the odd rows, the nth child, the even rows, we can give a different background color to. Yes? Yeah, you could do that. So, yeah. I believe you just leave it out. Because if you don't specify something, it's going to take the default of the table. So taking out the white style rule did the same thing. You can give your table a caption. A caption would say what the data in the table means. This is good for accessibility reasons because that helps people that are accessing it via screen reader to sort of put this in context, to sort of know what they're getting into. And you put in a caption like this. And it puts it there. What if you don't like it there? Well, we should know this by now, right? We can change that via CSS. So I could put in CSS to say caption, font family, Arial, Helvetica, sans serif, font size 2M, font color blue. Should just be color, not font color. And I want to text align left. All right. All right, I have a question. Let's say I wanted to do this. We'll talk about how to do this because it's important to understand the HTML and CSS, and we'll talk a little bit about server-side scripting. How could I make it so that I visually indicated by the background color which days were going to be rainy, which days were going to be sunny, and which days are going to be cloudy? Let's say I want to make the sunny days yellow, the rainy days blue, and the cloudy days gray. How could I do that? Well, you should, first off, if this is a question on Jeopardy, you're on Jeopardy and it's the final round and it's web development was the category. First question you should ask yourself is this a CSS or an HTML question? It's CSS because I talked about I want to make this data look a certain way. All right, so he knows the CSS. CSS has two parts, right? CSS has a selector and CSS has a style rule. The style rule. We know how to make the background of something blue, yellow, or gray, right? That's just background :blue, background :yellow, background :gray. So the real question is what selector do I use? Okay? Now, can I use an HTML tag for a selector? No, because not all TDs are sunny days. All right, some of the TDs are cloudy, some of the TDs are rainy, some of the TDs are cloudy. So, in a way, you should think, well, I want special, some CDs to be or some TDs to be this way, some TDs to be that way. Whenever you hear that, what kind of leaps to mind is class or ID. Which is more appropriate for this, class or ID? A class. And why class? Because there's not just one rainy day or not just one sunny day, or at least not the potential. I'm going to go get rid of these extra rows now. They've served their purpose. And I'm going to define a class of sunny, class equals rainy, and class equals cloudy. So the thought process again is HTML versus CSS. If it's an HTML question, what tag and attributes do I need? If it's a CSS question, what is the selector? What is going to be the style rule? Now, depending on how elaborate you want to make this, you could actually put background images behind them, right? Now, some of these are hard to see, all right, because of the black text on that background, and maybe we want to tone it down a little bit. What can we do? We can visit our color chart. That might be a good color of blue for rain. 33CCFF. And as far as gray goes, maybe we make it $AAAAAAA. And a little bit more readable. We might even want to go lighter still. All right. Now, again, we could represent that. The nice thing is once we defined it as cloudy, rainy, and sunny, we could go in and we could change the way that we do that. We could, for example, put a background image of a sun or a background image of a rain cloud or whatever. Yes?
You mentioned also images that I know, because I'm having some issue with, earlier you said not to use tables for layout, but if we have a situation where I have a lot of photos on one page and I want them in the written structure, like in a photo, tab thing, is that
Is that a table of data?
table?
Is that a table of data?
It would be pictures.
No. So don't use it. Well, I won't say you can do it, but it's probably not a good idea. Decreases. Think about it. All right. Let's say you have a 3x3 grid of pictures. Think of maybe how you'd want to display that on a mobile device. On a mobile device, you might want to display that as one line of pictures, one column of pictures. All right. Therefore, you'd be better off using CSS to style it. Yeah, we can talk about it in lab. It's actually not that hard, and it's like far more flexible. All right. There are a couple other tags that you can use for styling. There's a T head, a T There's a T head, a T body, and a T foot. All right. T head, you can wrap around all your headers. If you have multiple rows for headings, you could do that. T foot, you can do things like sums or averages or something like that. And then T body, you have the body of that. So you can use that. Frankly, where that comes in most handy is if you have a footer row. If you have a footer row, it's good to say that, hey, this isn't part of the data. This is like a total or an average or whatever. Now, as far as accessibility goes, I'm going to start by putting in an ID for each of my headers. Notice no space in a ID. So I got to run Los Angeles together. The header serves the similar role of a label. I use it to point to an ID of what defines that. So for example, 85 and sunny is what? Is Cleveland's forecast for Tuesday. So I would put in here headers equals Cleveland Tuesday. Then I can do the similar thing for the next row. All right. Does this affect the way the table displays? Of course not. But it allows a screen reader to associate it much the way that a screen reader associates a label in there. So each thing that constitutes sort of a header, like for example, these are column headers. This is like a row header, Cleveland. You define an ID for, and then for each data cell, you identify the column or the row and the column that it belongs to, using the ID of the row and column. Now you may look at this and say, putting a class of sunny or rainy or cloudy, putting these headers, is a lot of work for a table. Yes, it is. It's a lot of work if you've finished your table and you go back and want to add to it. All right? And want to change it. It's one of those things like, after you've moved into the house, trying to do remodeling and putting in a wheelchair ramp or something like that. Something for accessibility that's built in from the start is typically going to be less expensive than something that you go back and add later on. Also keep in mind that in larger applications, this code is going to be generated by a server-side script. So if I had literally a table that showed every city in the country, every major city in the country, and it showed, say, 200 cities in it, all right, I wouldn't hand code 200 cities, the headers and the classes and all that. I would have a server-side script that would do that in some programmatic way. All right? So that's sort of the good news. We have to understand how to do it ourselves manually, but we're going to write code to do that at some point. Questions about this? All right. I do want to give time for you to work on your projects and assignments and all that, but I also want to introduce JavaScript to you today, even if we don't get very far. All right, so we'll start talking about JavaScript. We have a little more than a half hour. And we'll go from there. Let's look at a page that uses JavaScript. That's the problem with having websites memorized. They go and change them on you, and you have to come up with another example. All right, hey, we need to go no further than our own web page. All right, let's look at this. I went on to, from the home, I went to the current students page. All right. Notice the way this navigation works. Academic resources, it shows me those things. If I put my mouse over academic offerings, it shows me these things. Academic support, it shows me those. Paying for college, campus life, student services. All right. Let's think about this. First of all, how quickly do these appear as I put my mouse over it? Anyone have a stopwatch? Let's go. Ready? All right. Virtually instantaneously. All right. As I put my mouse over a different link, the sub-navigation over here changes virtually immediately. So let's think through that for a second. Let's think through that. And let's go back to the diagram that I always put up here. When I talked about Google searches, we have a client who is, in this case, me working my web browser, who's connected to the internet. Who is connected to a web server. In this case, LC's web server. Now, normally when I request a page, if I type in a URL in my address bar, that request goes through the internet, hits the server, and the response, the HTML, gets sent back to the client. Now that happens very quickly, especially here on campus, right? Because we have a very fast internet connection. I'm not sitting there waiting. But there is a noticeable amount of time. So, for example, what's another way that I could request a URL? By clicking a link. So I could either type in an address or click a link. So I type in our home page's address. All right, it took a little bit of time there. I click a link. Fast, but it took a visible amount of time for the page to load. That's because no matter how fast the internet connection is, this is sort of the bottleneck. Or potentially this is the bottleneck in here. All right? There's going to be some time, if you're going through the internet, it's going to be some time for your request to get routed to the server and have that request go back to you. Might not be a lot of time. When we were doing Bing searches last week, we'd click on it, and a split second later it would appear, but it wasn't instantaneous, and that's the important thing. When we click on a page on LC's site, it's not instantaneous. It takes a little bit of time. Yet, when we put our mouse over those different menu selections, the page changes instantaneously. All right? So that should show us that something different is going on here. We're not going through the internet to the web server and getting back a new web page. All right? What is happening instead? Well, this could be done a couple different ways. Without getting into the code and analyzing it, I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure I know what's happening here. All right? When I go to that page, the current student's page, I get back a chunk of HTML and a chunk of CSS. All right? I also get back, as part of that HTML, all the submenus. All right? So when I go and view that page, initially the first submenu shows, but I have gotten back from the web server the HTML for all the submenus. Why am I only seeing one of them? Because the CSS hides all but one submenu. So the HTML code is there, but big chunks of it are hidden via the CSS. And I get back one more thing from the server, and that is some JavaScript. JavaScript allows us to change the HTML or CSS of a page without going back to the server. All right? So you don't have to bother the server to display the new submenu. All right? That's a win-win situation, right? It's a win for the client because they get an immediate response. It's a win for the server because they're not asked to handle a bunch of little requests like display this submenu. No, wait, display this submenu instead. No, wait, display this submenu instead. The restaurant analogy, again, everything comes back to a food or restaurant analogy, would be that when you go to a restaurant and let's say you order fries, the waiter will bring over your dinner with your plate of fries, will also leave on your plate or on your table ketchup, salt, and pepper, right? Can you imagine what it would be like if every time you wanted a little bit more ketchup for your fries, you had to flag down the waiter? All right? The waiter certainly would not enjoy that. The waiter has important stuff to do that only the waiter can do. You can put your own ketchup on your fries. You're capable of doing that. In fact, you're more capable than the waiter is of doing that. Likewise with salt and pepper. You're happy because you don't have to sit there and wait for your fries to get cold for the waiter to find some time to come over to squirt some ketchup on them. You can get a response immediately. All right? Well, the client and the server in this equation are both computers. This client can run code just like the server could run code. So what gets delivered in a case like this is all the HTML that is needed. So all the submenus get loaded. CSS, though, hides all but one. And then JavaScript changes either the HTML or the CSS of the page to reflect something happening. In this case, it's probably as simple as the CSS hides the old menu and shows the new submenu. Now, this isn't 100%, but the recipe for Java, client-side JavaScript, typically works something like this. A user event, some sort of action, sets the ball rolling. All right? Not all JavaScript works this way, but pretty much most of it does. Some user event starts the ball rolling. The DOM is used to point to specific elements on the page. DOM stands for Document Object Model. All right? The Document Object Model is the way within your JavaScript code that you can say, hey, this is something I want to do something to. I want to hide this submenu, and I want to show this submenu. How does JavaScript know which one we show and which one we hide? It's based on the DOM. The DOM allows us to point to specific things on the page so that we can do something to them. Then finally, JavaScript manipulates the attributes, whether they be CSS or HTML, for the element that are relevant. So, in this case, JavaScript code would be written to hide the old submenu and display the new submenu. How is that done? Well, there's CSS for the visibility or the display property of a section of code. So JavaScript changes that. So let's keep this formula in mind as we go back and look at that example. All right. Moving my mouse around. What's the user action that gets the ball rolling? Putting the mouse over one of these links over here. That's the user action that starts things off. How is the DOM used? The DOM is used to point to something on the page so that we can either show it or hide it. So in other words, when this page loads for the first time, all of these submenus are loaded when the page initially loads. Let's view the source of this. All right. We can see here that when this page loads, even though we can't see it, this code gets sent. This code has an ID of tab content 7, and it corresponds to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The 7, wait a minute. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 corresponds to the 7th little tab. So the code for all 7 of these gets loaded. And here we can see that. So the HTML is there for all of these. All right? It's done as a div. All right? And if we looked, there's the 6th tab. Campus Life. Careers and Employment. and so on down the line. So the HTML for all of these gets loaded when the page initially gets loaded. So the HTML contains all 7 of these submenus. Through CSS, only one of them is displayed at a time. CSS, when the page loads initially, will display the first tab. All right, the CSS is set initially to display the first tab. And then, as we move our mouse over different things, we show or hide the tab. Let's try to duplicate this functionality. We're not going to do it as elaborately as this, but let's try to duplicate this functionality.
It's really like a hover, right? I mean, isn't that what's happening? It's like a hover, you know, we hover to change the font color of the links and stuff.
Yeah, it's a hover. It could. There's a few ways that this could be done. But we're going to look at the JavaScript way to do that. I just want to show you how all these things sort of work together. CSS, HTML, and JavaScript. So I'm going to start out with a nav. And I'm going to make it an unordered list. I'm going to put 3 things on it. All right, so here's my main navigation. I'm going to make 3 more of these. Make 3 more of these. All right, here's the HTML part. The HTML part is I have my main menu and I have my 3 submenus. And if I display this, that's what I see. My CSS. There's no CSS here, so nothing is really relevant. All right, we see all of them. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to write CSS to hide everything but the first sub-menu. All right? Well, first, before I do that, or along with doing that, I'm going to try to put the submenus side by side. Try to put them side by side. I'm going to hide all of them, but the first. So, I'm going to say # sub2 display none. Along with sub3 display none. Forgot the end style tag. Notice me, the seasoned professional that I am, did not panic, because usually something like that is you forgot to close a tag. Okay, so now the two navigation things are next to each other, right? And we're only seeing the first subnav. That's kind of the situation, done a lot less elegantly, but that's kind of the situation that we have when the page loads on LC's website. We don't have any mouse over effects yet, though. All right? That's what we're going to do now. All right? So, I'm going to put here on mouse over, I want to point to the thing on the page. I want to show the first submenu. So I have to point to the thing on the page. This isn't entirely correct, but we'll see what this does. And I'll do this for number 2. And I'll do this for number 3. See that again. Put my mouse over that, and subnav 2 pops up. Forgot to change that to sub 3. That's why sub 3 wasn't working. Okay, so sub 1 shows initially. I put my mouse over that one. Sub 2 shows up. Put my mouse over that one. Sub 3 shows up. So we're pretty far along with this, except for one thing. All right? What we really want to do is we want to hide the other two when we show 1. All right? So that's the only thing that's missing from this. What I do want to spend a minute, instead of going over that though, I want to spend a minute going over what this means. On mouse over equals, and then I have a big long expression here. All right. On mouse over is the user event that gets the ball rolling. Remember, typically that's how JavaScript gets initiated. The user does something. One of the things that JavaScript is said to add to a page is interactivity. What do we mean by interactivity? You do something, the page responds in a certain manner. So on mouse over is one of the handful of events, and there's maybe 15 or so events that you can have, so I guess more than a handful, that you can write code for. There's on mouse over, on mouse out, on mouse click, on key down, on key up. You know, those of you that use Twitter, as you type something in, it counts down how many characters you have left. Well, there's JavaScript that when you press a key, it looks to see how long your message is, and it counts, and it tells you how many you have left. In this case, our event is on mouse over. That's one of the popular events for a mouse over. Now, this is a DOM expression. Document, get element, actually the whole thing is a DOM expression, but we're going to look at this part first. Document.getElement by ID sub 1. What that is saying is find the thing on the page that has an ID of sub 1. Document means it's somewhere on this web page. You could also, you could use JavaScript to manipulate a pop-up window that you popped up. All right? But document says, hey, I want to find the thing on this page. GetElement by ID says the thing on the page that I'm interested in has this foreign ID, sub 1. All right? Which corresponds to this. And the second one says sub 2, the third one says sub 3. So this points to the thing on the page that has an ID of sub 1. What do we want to change about it? We want to change its style. What do we want to change about the style? We want to change the way that it is displayed. Remember, in our initial CSS, we set the display for 2 and 3 to be none. What we want to do is change that display to block. So to revisit the recipe for doing JavaScript, a user action, we use the DOM to point to the thing on the page that we're interested in changing. We then write a JavaScript expression to change the particular attributes of it, whether it be CSS or HTML. Now I realize this is a lot of stuff to go over in one day, so if you don't understand this, I will hope to clarify this more on Thursday. We will also address on Thursday sort of that little issue that we have of when we show one submenu, we should hide the other two submenus instead of just showing each one in succession. All right, so we'll address that one as well. Any questions over this? Keep in mind that none of your assignments or the project require you to use JavaScript. This is really an introduction to sort of give you a sense and sort of complete the picture. And hopefully give you some incentive to continue learning this. Yes?
And all of JavaScript is done in the text editor within our code and stuff like the stars, like the root directory and stuff. We have a JavaScript file then too, or?
Well, JavaScript is like CSS in that you could have your JavaScript as part of your HTML document, or you could have a separate JavaScript file. So yeah, you could do that either way. All right, we'll see you in lab. Take care.